my computer. It's just easier that way. Okay. So good morning and thank you. I'd like to welcome everyone to our very first episode of the M Squared podcast. I'd like to start off by introducing Tanya Boyd. Tanya is a good friend of mine and somebody I have come to know and love, and she is a fellow Health Rosetta advisor. And she introduced me to Cole Egger, who I am going to turn the stage over to her and allow her to introduce Cole and tell you a little bit more about him.
Thank you, Nancy. I'd love to tell you about Cole. So Cole and I have known each other for several years. He became a client. He was referred to me. I didn't really know him that well, but I know something about Cole is that anything that he touches, it's going to be great. That's just how his brain works. That's how he is. And when he launched Listeners on Call, the more I learned about this and the more I read about it, the more intrigued I became. And you're going to get to know about this as we talk through this episode. I'm really honored to be able to watch this grow and help thousands, if not millions of people. The timing couldn't be better. So I'm thrilled that we're doing this and we're giving an opportunity for people to learn about this. You're going to love Cole.
Awesome. Okay. Well, Cole, so tell us a little bit about yourself, a little bit of background, and then tell us what the heck is Listeners on Call.
Sure. No, absolutely. And Tanya, thank you for the background. They're very humbling. So thank you. And I've certainly enjoyed getting to know you and work with you and Nancy both. So thank you for that. So Listeners on Call is a platform very personal to me, something that actually conceptually started about 5 years ago. We didn't launch the platform until about a year and a half ago when we formed the company. But Listeners on Call was really built out of a personal experience that I had with my father. 5 years ago, my father was diagnosed with a blood cancer, and the only cure for that cancer was a stem cell transplant. And I actually, out of all the individuals in the bone marrow bank, actually wound up being the best match for my father. And so that ultimately weighed very heavy on me in the sense that if my stem cells ultimately didn't work, which I knew I didn't have control over, but if they didn't work, then my father wasn't going to make it. At the same time, I unfortunately happened to be going through a fairly rocky divorce. And I found myself in a place that I was unfamiliar with for the first time in my life at 34 years old. I didn't really know what to do. I grew up on a small farm and ranch community in West Texas with the mentality of pull yourself up by your bootstraps, if you will. And so wearing my feelings and emotions on my sleeve or being comfortable in talking about those was just not something that I was good at doing. And so I was kind of at a loss. And so for the first time in my life, I reached out to a couple different licensed therapists, and over the course of about 6 months and several $1,000s later, I ended up walking away from licensed therapy. Certainly not because the individuals weren't good people. They were actually great therapists, but ultimately for me, it really came down to compatibility and convenience. I just didn't really feel like anyone truly understood what I was going through. And so I yet again found myself in a rough spot, and I ultimately was introduced to a lady here in town who ran support groups. And I said, for reasons of stigma, that's not something I feel like I can do. Like most probably men face a challenge with today, seems to be a common theme. But I was fortunate that she agreed to meet with me one-on-one. And after some of our initial conversations, learned that she had been through several very similar experiences herself. And because of reasons of compatibility, ultimately over the course of the next year, she really kind of turned my life around and my outlook on where things were. And so that really had a major impact in my life at that time. I was fortunate that then my father had gone into remission. You fast forward a couple of years, and I found myself yet again in an unfamiliar territory where my father had unfortunately been re-diagnosed with cancer. And as I started spending more and more time in the hospital, I would see families coming in the hospital, and I would ask myself, where do they go? Who do they turn to? Who are they talking to in a time of need, much like I had been through? And the answer was, I didn't know. As I visited with a few families here and there, I came to learn that being able to connect with somebody who has gone through a similar or shared experience was very challenging and very difficult for most. And I became increasingly frustrated that, we live in a time where quite literally anything you can imagine, you can have on demand today when you think about the services like Uber or DoorDash or Wag. But the idea of the most basic of human needs, this idea of human connection based around shared experiences, didn't exist. And that was really the foundation for creating Listeners on Call, was to empower the millions of individuals out there today who've chosen a lifetime of empathy in their profession, whether that be social workers, teachers, nurses, caregivers, and others, to be able to support individuals um, in their time of need on demand. And that's really when we started Listeners on Call.
Well, that is very cool. I mean, I'm just, it seems like such an obvious thing that no one has addressed before. So it's, I love the concept before it. So, okay, so you came up with the idea, then what happened next?
Yeah, well, a lot, I would say, between then and now. But we were fortunate to be able to put together a very solid team. We went into product development, creating the application, really started looking at who we felt would be the listeners early on, who would be most apt to listen on the platform, most qualified. Much like Uber, we oftentimes get coined the Uber of empathy, as an analogy that gets used quite often. But much like Uber, you have to have drivers before you can have riders, right? And so for us, it was really focusing on those empathetic listeners and being able to work with those individuals. And so, pretty exciting to say that in our first 30 days, we had over 1,000 listeners on the platform, over 100,000 available hours to be able to serve those in a time of need. And so things have moved quite quickly over the last few months.
So, of course, we all know that no one's actually an overnight success. It just looks like that on the front end because they didn't see all the hard work you were doing underneath the water to get it up and running. Okay, so you've got your listeners in place, you have your platform. Who's the first customer?
Yeah, so great question. I think our first few customers were actually our listeners. I think the reality is that even those who probably see themselves or others see them as those who are supporting and there to support others as a listener, we all face challenges. We all find ourselves in a time of need where we could use someone to talk to from time to time. So our earliest customers as individuals were actually listeners on the platform. And then actually one of our first corporate customers was actually a mobile ad agency with 700 employees who is very proactive in ensuring the mental health and well-being of their employees, and really look to provide Listeners on Call and our perks program as a human connection benefit for their employees. And that's continued to go extremely well.
Okay, so what exactly makes a good listener? What is a listener? Where do the listeners come from? I guess I'll give the three-pronged approach there, because I don't think we really defined for our audience what exactly a listener is. How are they qualified and where do they come from?
Sure. So from a listener perspective, we believe that anyone has the opportunity to be a good listener. We look for our listeners to provide perspective, insight on experiences that they may have shared, and simply serve as a sounding board. Every listener who participates in our platform has to go through a criminal background check. Then they actually go through an onboarding and education training process, which we have created in-house as part of our proprietary training platform. That platform today is focused on what we call connected listening, whereby we look to create a bond, using our bond framework between our caller and our listener. And so our bond method really stands for: be present, give your absolute attention to a caller, open your heart, be authentic with your empathy, note what they mean, be discerning about what they say, and then deliver assurance, be supportive of their perspective. And so that is really the framework and the training that we look to instill in our listeners prior to them becoming a listener on the platform.
Cole, I've got a question. Nancy and I are both agency owners. We specialize in health insurance. And of course, EAP programs are very, very popular, but we find that they're very much underutilized. Would you agree, Nancy?
100%.
So sometimes they're connected to an insurance product. This is almost like a mini EAP program. How would you compare it to an EAP, and how might it be better for an employer and an HR and their employees?
Sure. No, a great question. So, traditional APs, as you said, are typically underutilized, statistically between 4 and 7% engagement on an annual basis. I think primarily that's due for employees having a hard time understanding how to navigate the EAPs. There's also often a lot of perceived stigma associated with, divulging personal information through an EAP for which an employee feels it could either be shared with the employer or, sadly, and sometimes maybe even leaked to the employer. So, I understand that a lot of EAPs also offer teletherapy and telemed services, but many times employees just simply need someone to talk to. It's just about human connection. We all face challenges in our daily lives, and employees are no different. But that doesn't mean it requires a licensed therapist to simply vent about being a parent with 2 kids at home during a time of COVID. So sometimes we're really just looking for human connection with others who have gone through a very similar shared experience. So with listeners on call, our platform is completely anonymous for the caller, and your information is never revealed with the listener or your employer. We also believe that compatibility with those that you confide in is extremely critical to the overall outcome and conversation of improving your mental health and well-being. We never force you into a connection. We simply present listeners that are available based on your comfort and compatibility. You ultimately, as the caller, choose who you determine to connect with. And so I think, when we start to look at some of the differences between our platform and EAPs, those are some of the things that come top of mind. With regards to, the HR plan and what that could look like, I think our platform, which we call Perks, which is personal conversations for employees, is positioned as a pre-EAP. I think that's what you shared earlier. And I think we really look to be that place where employees go to take that first step, right? I think sometimes you look at traditional EAPs and say, that's for a much more serious matter. Maybe that's even a medical or emergency situation. But again, especially in the world and the time that we're all living in today, the topics of loneliness or isolation are topics that aren't traditionally looked at as something that I would go to address with an EAP. And those are the topics that we see most common on our platform today. We see listeners on call in our Perks program, as I mentioned earlier, is a benefit of human connection for employees, which in our case, employers can actually subsidize just like they would an EAP through traditional HR plans for their employees.
So I'm going to piggyback on that question a little bit, because as you just described it, I can see that you don't take the place of an EAP, nor do they take your place. They fill two separate niches. But again, both Tanya and I work in we're both Health Rosetta advisors. And so we're always working in the environment of trying to find ways to help employers improve their benefits while reducing their costs. So I'm thinking specifically, let's say we're talking about a self-funded employer that is dealing with a lot of different costs. It seems like having this listeners on demand, or listeners on call, I'm sorry, in as a separate benefit, it could actually benefit the employer as far as reducing the cost, because I understand the access cost point, price point is a lot less, and you're creating happier, healthier employees. So I can see there being a win-win. Could you possibly talk to that a little bit?
Sure, and don't worry about the listeners on demand. Our listeners are on demand, so that actually works out well. No, you're exactly right. I think we certainly do not look to replace or supplement traditional EAP programs. We see ourselves positioned as a pre-EAP or even as a bolt-on solution for employers because of the low barrier and friction we have of an entry point. We can actually have our service implemented in less than 60 days for a fraction of the cost. And like you shared, we are a platform of human connection that allows employees to be able to connect with somebody on demand whenever they need. And so, we don't look to come in and replace the EAPs. And so we've seen a lot of traction early on that serves as a very unique, timely, and relevant benefit of human connection, especially in the world that we live in today with COVID and what's going on.
I've got a question. So, Cole, when we started talking about this and how I thought this is a great benefit for brokers, health insurance professionals, advisors trying to look for ways to reduce cost. Well, we know if an employee comes to work and they're upset, whether they're whatever it might be, financial, loneliness, relationship issues, they don't like this current state of 2020. I mean, that's enough to throw everybody over the edge, right?
Right.
So we started talking about this, and I thought this would make a really great benefit for employers. The question came up, I think Nancy even asked me, well, how much can you take on? How many listeners do you have? If the supply, it goes crazy, how do you feel that demand? Could you touch on that just a little bit?
Sure, absolutely. So, I think we get asked that question often, and sometimes the question comes out to, well, I don't know if a service like this would be relevant for my employees. I have 10, 20, 50 employees versus another organization that may have 500, 5,000 plus. And I think it's kind of a silly question to some extent, in that loneliness, isolation doesn't judge based on the size of your company, based on the industry that you're in, right? The reality is that statistically today, there's 73% of adults self-identify as being lonely on an annual basis, and that's a pretty remarkable statistic when you start to think about it. So, and especially in the time where we're headed now to Q4, right, which is also statistically the loneliest time of the year. So our platform today, as I mentioned earlier, we had over 1,000 listeners on our platform in the first 30 days. I would tell you that number today has almost doubled. We have actually slowed that process because we have so many available listeners today to meet any demand that we need. And we're very fortunate that we continue to have listeners come to our platform who want to be available to help and support others. So from a size and scale perspective, there really aren't any constraints that we would face now or in the future.
Well, I love that answer. Loneliness doesn't discriminate based on size of employer. Tanya and I both also work with smaller employers, and sometimes finding solutions available for smaller employers can be a little bit of a challenge. So it's really exciting to know that you can service all types of employer sizes. And speaking of that, she shared with me that one of your largest clients is a university. And so I'd like to specifically ask, how are you seeing this making a difference, especially in the younger generation? Because I know that they're less likely, in my experience, less likely to call and make an appointment to go in and physically see somebody. So this seems like it could be a great middle ground or starting entry point for that younger generation. Could you address that a little bit?
Nancy,
Yeah.
the key is it's a phone app. So
Yeah, I
what
know.
person does not have their phone in their hand 24 hours a day?
I know. That's what I love about it.
I have two daughters, 21
Yeah.
and 18. So yeah.
Yeah.
Go ahead, Cole.
Yeah, no, thank you. The university space has really kind of exploded, to be quite honest. I think, the reality is even prior to everyone using the word COVID, there was an epidemic of mental health in our country, in our workplace, on college campuses, across our nation as a whole. And when you start to look at the statistics that were on college campuses prior to COVID, you had statistically 10 to 15% of college students were visiting an on-campus counselor or counselor center on a monthly basis. Now, the reality is that statistics would also tell you is that the majority of time they were unable to see a counselor. Wait times on average were between 4 and 10 weeks to see an on-campus counselor at universities. And that's just a number that's unacceptable, in my opinion. Now we're talking about what's going on with COVID. Those numbers are expected to almost double as to the needs on campus. How do you handle those needs both virtually and on campus, depending on what week it is and where we fall? Seems like we almost change weekly these days. So Listeners on Call has been very well received in the college community. We actually had an article that was released in the New York Times last week. We started working now with 7 different D1 universities who student body presidents and student governments are endorsing Listeners on Call as a scalable mental health resource for college students. And so it's something that, again, we've been very well received on college campuses. I think from a technology standpoint, I know Tanya mentioned being a mobile app, and who doesn't have their phone in their hands today, but especially as a college student. And I think the other big part of that, quite honestly, is the anonymity. On the side of the caller and the college student, so much is geared towards stigma and the idea of sharing what may be going on or challenges that I may be facing. But the idea of being able to connect with somebody who's been through that experience before, somebody who you can hear a part of their story before you ultimately connect, and then do so anonymously, is something that we've seen gain a tremendous amount of traction with.
That's awesome. So on the flip side of that, what do you see? I don't know if you track any of this or not, but are you seeing utilization in seniors? Because that's another population that's very lonely and isolated, especially now. So I don't know how potentially we could make more people aware of this, but it sounds like it'd be amazing for them as well.
Well, I'll tell you transparently, and not giving away any secrets here, but we have not started focusing on that audience specifically at this time. We have some pretty unique things coming out in 2021 that I'm really excited for in the senior community. I'll leave it with give the gift of listening is a direction that we're going, and we're pretty excited about what's ahead.
Oh, that sounds exciting. Tanya, do you have anything else that you wanted to ask Cole?
I mean, I just wanted to say this just real quick, and then yes, I do want to ask him some questions. I was on a conference not too long ago, and it was a women's leadership conference, Zoom, obviously, and there was so much time spent on mental health and people working remotely and just out of their routine and how it affected them. And I kept hearing the words over and over again, just call somebody. If we would just call somebody, just pick up the phone and call somebody, over and over. And so I immediately sent Cole a message. I said, Cole, this is such a real thing. We don't know who to call sometimes. We just sometimes want to talk to somebody, but it's like, oh, we don't want to feel whiny. We don't want to complain. Everybody has their own issues. And, this could mean the difference between life or death. It could save someone's life. Mental health is real. We know that people are on antidepressants, anti-anxiety. I mean, I went to get a routine physical, and my doctor basically said they're seeing less people for COVID and more people for antidepressants, anti-anxiety medications, and depression since all of this has happened. And, medication is medication. It's not a cure, right? And does everybody need to be on that medication? This could really cut down on unneeded medications, overprescribing. And the anonymity, I think, is amazing for sure. So I just wanted to say that. Nicole disappeared on us. He's going to get his smartphone.
Oh, no, I apologize. Another phone went off.
That's okay. So as someone who has experienced a lot of suicide in my family, I certainly appreciate the value of mental health and the value of a wide variety of resources to access and meet the person wherever they're at, whether it's just somebody to talk to, whether it is, a behavioral counselor, whether it's medication, et cetera. The more avenues we have, the more people that can be reached. So tell us, Cole, where can people access Listeners on Call? Where can they find out more information?
Sure, absolutely. So we have an app in the App Store. We are in the iOS and Google Play Store. You can search Listeners on Call and find us there, or on the web at listenersoncall.com.
Awesome. Tanya, any closing thoughts?
Well, your vision. So when we talked, Cole, I don't know, a month ago, 2 months ago about this, did you envision rolling this out in the broker health insurance community, working with insurance brokers, insurance professionals, rolling it out to their clients? Was this something that you had as a vision, or did this come about later? And then where is that vision taking you now?
Sure, I would say that we've always felt that there was an opportunity in the corporate world. Again, kind of going back to one of those comments I made earlier, is that loneliness doesn't discriminate. And when we start to look at what's going on out there today, there's certainly a lot of loneliness. And then the topic of mental health, again, was one of the topics in the forefront within the employer space prior to COVID even hitting. And so that's always been on our roadmap. And I think as far as our vision goes, I think, our goal and our mission is to ensure that everyone has the opportunity to be heard when they need to connect with someone. So Nancy, you made a great point earlier, being able to meet somebody where they're at, right? And I think that the irony of the times that we live in is that we have more technology and more means of connection than we ever have in the history of our country. Yet today we are the loneliest that we have ever been in the history of our country as well. And I think, our hopes are is that we can actually leverage technology today to bridge that gap of disconnection that has been created, largely in part to technology. When you start to think through things like social media, artificial intelligence, and others, today there's the term false friends, and so many people who judge their life based on likes or comments on a page from individuals who not only have they never met, nor will they ever meet. I believe that we have an opportunity to really bridge that gap of human connection through listeners on call.
Awesome.
That's wonderful.
And I want to tell you that I called Nancy immediately and I said, Nancy, you've got to meet Cole. You have to listen to his story, because we can help so many people. And this is why I love Nancy so much, because really we just want to help people. At the end of the day, what we do is we help people. And I don't think that you can be unhappy while you're helping someone. Do you agree, Nancy?
I agree 100%. And I think that's why we have such a similar vision, and all the things that we put out there, the health insurance, all those things, those are tools we use to help people. But the bottom line is, as Tanya says, we really want to help people. We want to help people improve their lives. We want to give them better mental health. And this is really exciting to both of us to see such a cool product, such a cool service. I hate to call it a product because it really is more of a service. So we're really excited to get behind it and help promote Listeners on Call to become just a common everyday thing that people can access whenever they're feeling lonely or isolated.
Or
Thank you. I appreciate it. Or angry. I appreciate that. I think, come November 3rd, regardless of which side you sit on, I have a feeling that need to vent will be one of our top topics.
It definitely will. It definitely will. So thank you both. I think this was a lot of fun. I think that everybody is going to be very excited when they hear this. I think the first thing they're going to do is pick up their phone and download the app. So again, Listeners on Call is available in both the Apple and the iOS and the Android store. So download it, and you can visit their website, Listeners on Call, for more information. So thanks, everybody.
Thank you, Cole.
Thanks, Nancy. Thank you, Tanya.
Thanks.
Appreciate it.
Okay.
Thank you both.
Bye-bye.
All right, hang on. I'm going to stop.